May 14th, 1944, Admiral Toyoda Soemu sat alone in his office at the Navy Ministry in Tokyo, a single sheet of paper resting on the desk before him. The document had arrived that morning from Naval Intelligence, stamped with red characters indicating urgent priority. It contained a list, just a list, nothing more, but this list would change everything. Confirmed United States Navy aircraft carrier commissionings, December 1941 to May 1944. Below it, names and dates scrolled down the page in neat columns. USS Essex, USS Lexington, USS Bunker Hill, USS Yorktown. The names kept coming. USS Intrepid, USS Hornet, USS Franklin, USS Ticonderoga. On and on, line after line, name after name, date after date. Toyoda counted them twice, then a third time. Certain there had been a clerical error. There had not. In the 2.5 years since Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy had commissioned 51 aircraft carriers. 51. And according to intelligence estimates appended to the report, another 90 carriers were under construction or already launched, awaiting completion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Japan had entered the war with 10 aircraft carriers. In those same 2.5 years, Japanese shipyards had completed 9 new carriers, bringing the total constructed during the war to 9. The Americans had built 51 and were building 90 more. Toyoda set the paper down carefully, as if it might crumble under too much pressure. His hands, he noticed, were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of comprehension. This was not just a military defeat. This was mathematical certainty. This was the documentation of an industrial capacity so vast, so incomprehensible, that resistance itself had become a form of national suicide. The numbers told a story. The Japanese naval leadership had been desperately trying not to believe for over 2 years. But numbers, unlike propaganda or wishful thinking, could not be argued with. They could not be dismissed. They simply existed, cold and brutal and undeniable. Outside his window, Tokyo continued its daily rhythm. Streetcars rattled past. Workers hurried to their shifts at munitions factories. Schoolchildren marched in formation, practicing air raid drills. The city showed no outward sign of the catastrophe documented in the intelligence report. But Toyoda knew that every number on that page represented not just a ship, but an industrial ecosystem Japan could never replicate. Each carrier name represented tens of thousands of workers, millions of tons of steel, entire supply chains dedicated to a single purpose: Japan's defeat. To understand how Japan arrived at this moment, you must understand what they believed at the war's beginning. In December 1941, when Admiral Nagumo's carriers struck Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed the finest carrier force in the world. Their pilots had trained for years. Their tactics had been refined through combat in China. Their 6 fleet carriers represented the cutting edge of naval aviation. The Americans, by comparison, seemed weak. They had 7 carriers in total, only 3 stationed in the Pacific. Their pilots had limited combat experience. Their naval doctrine still emphasized battleships over carriers. The attack on Pearl Harbor was supposed to cripple American carrier power, buying Japan 6 months to a year to consolidate its conquests across the Pacific. What the Japanese High Command understood about industrial capacity was based on pre-war assessments. They knew America was wealthy, industrialized, capable of significant production. But the numbers they had calculated suggested American industrial output was perhaps 2 or 3 times Japan's capacity. Difficult odds, certainly, but not impossible if the war could be kept short. If America could be shocked into negotiating rather than fighting to total victory. These calculations had been made in conference rooms in Tokyo by men who had never seen an American automobile factory, never witnessed the scale of American steel production, never understood the fundamental difference between Japan's resource-constrained island economy and America's continental industrial base. They had looked at published statistics, made assumptions based on their own experience, and concluded that the gap, while significant, was manageable. They were catastrophically wrong. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, had studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington. He had traveled across America, seen the automobile factories of Detroit, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the shipyards of both coasts. He had tried to warn the Navy General Staff that America's industrial potential was far greater than they assumed. He had calculated what American factories could produce if converted to war production, and the numbers had terrified him. Yamamoto had driven through the American Midwest where farms stretched to the horizon. He had visited oil fields in Texas where derricks pumped continuously. He had toured the River Rouge plant in Detroit where Henry Ford's assembly lines produced a complete automobile every few minutes. He had stood on the docks in San Francisco and watched cargo ships being loaded with goods bound for Asia, Europe, South America. The sheer scale of American commerce, the volume of production, the abundance of resources had convinced him that war with America was unwinnable. But Yamamoto's warnings were dismissed by most of his colleagues. They had seen Japan's victories in China, in Malaya, in the Philippines. They had witnessed Japanese pilots sink the British battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse. They had captured Singapore, humiliated the Western powers across East Asia. Japanese fighting spirit, they believed, would overcome American industrial capacity. The officer corps of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been raised on stories of the Russo-Japanese War, where Japanese courage and tactical brilliance had defeated a larger enemy. Admiral Togo's victory at Tsushima had proven that spiritual strength and superior tactics could overcome numerical disadvantage. They believed the same principles would apply against America. They were fighting a spiritual war, not a material one. The Americans, they assured themselves, were soft, undisciplined, more interested in comfort than sacrifice. When faced with Japanese determination, American will would collapse. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 began to crack that confidence. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu all went to the bottom, and taking with them hundreds of Japan's most experienced pilots and crew. The loss was catastrophic, but the high command still believed it was recoverable. Japan retained 6 fleet carriers. They could rebuild. What they did not yet understand was the question that mattered. Not whether Japan could replace 4 carriers, but how fast America could replace 1. The first intelligence reports arrived in August 1942. The Americans had commissioned a new fleet carrier, USS Essex. Japanese analysts initially dismissed this as a ship that must have been nearly complete before Midway, simply finishing construction on its original schedule. But then came more reports, another Essex-class carrier launching, and another. By September, intelligence confirmed 6 Essex-class carriers at various stages of construction. 6 carriers. In the time it took Japan to assess the damage from Midway, the Americans were building 6 Sioux fleet carriers. The reports seemed impossible. Carriers took years to build. The construction of Akagi had required 4 years, Kaga, 5 years. Even with wartime acceleration, Japanese shipyards needed at least 2 years to complete a fleet carrier from keel laying to commissioning. The idea that America was building carriers faster than this violated everything Japanese naval architects understood about shipbuilding. Japanese naval architects were master craftsmen. Each ship was a unique creation, built with meticulous attention to detail. Workers spent months fitting individual components, adjusting systems, perfecting welds. Quality control was paramount. The result was beautifully engineered vessels, but the process was slow, labor-intensive, and difficult to accelerate. Japanese shipyards could not simply double production by adding workers. The specialized skills required took years to develop, but the intelligence kept coming, and it kept being verified. The Americans were not building carriers the way Japan built carriers. They were building them the way Henry Ford built automobiles, assembly line production, prefabricated sections, modular construction, standardized designs that could be replicated across multiple shipyards simultaneously. The Essex-class carriers were all identical. Same hull, same dimensions, same systems. This meant workers could be trained on one ship and immediately apply that knowledge to the next. It meant components could be manufactured at inland factories and shipped to coastal shipyards for assembly. It meant construction time could be compressed to 18 months, then 16 months, then 14 months. American shipyards had revolutionized naval construction in ways Japanese observers struggled to comprehend. At Newport News Shipbuilding, workers assembled prefabricated sections that had been built by subcontractors across Virginia and the Carolinas. At the Philadelphia Navy Yard, shifts ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Women who had never worked outside the home before Pearl Harbor were now welding hull plates. Farmers from Iowa were installing electrical systems. The Americans had taken specialized craftwork and transformed it into industrial production. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. By early 1943, American shipyards were commissioning a new Essex-class fleet carrier approximately every 60 days. Every 2 months, a new 30,000-ton carrier joined the Pacific Fleet, and the Essex-class carriers were just the beginning. Intelligence reports in late 1942 identified another class of American carrier under construction. Smaller, lighter, faster to build, the Independence-class light carriers were being constructed on cruiser hulls converted during construction from Cleveland-class light cruisers to aircraft carriers. 9 were under construction. 9 carriers that would each carry 30 to 40 aircraft, built in roughly half the time of an Essex-class fleet carrier. The Independence class represented American pragmatism at its most efficient. Rather than wait for fleet carriers to be completed, the Americans had looked at cruiser hulls already under construction and asked a simple question: could these be converted to carriers? The answer was yes. Within months, 9 cruisers became 9 light carriers. Each one sacrificed some capability compared to a fleet carrier, but each one could operate aircraft project power and be completed in a fraction of the time. The Americans understood that good enough, delivered quickly, was better than perfect, delivered late. And then came the most disturbing reports. The Americans were building escort carriers, small carriers constructed on merchant ship hulls designed for convoy protection and ground support. These ships could be built in less than a year. Some were being completed in as little as 6 months. Japanese intelligence officers read these reports with growing disbelief. The Americans were not just building fleet carriers, they were building carriers of every type, in every size category, using every available shipyard. They were treating carrier construction the way peacetime economies treated consumer goods production, not as a careful, specialized process, but as mass manufacturing. The escort carriers particularly disturbed Japanese analysts because they represented a category of vessel Japan had never considered building. Small, slow, carrying perhaps 24 aircraft, these ships seemed almost useless by Japanese standards, but the Americans were building them by the dozens. They assigned them to Atlantic convoys to hunt U-boats. They used them for training new pilots. They sent them to support amphibious landings. The Americans had carriers to spare for secondary missions, while Japan struggled to find carriers for primary operations. By mid-1943, the scope of American carrier production became undeniable. Admiral Koga Mineichi, who had assumed command of the combined fleet after Yamamoto's death in April, received a comprehensive intelligence assessment. The numbers were staggering. The United States Navy would commission 9 new Essex-class fleet carriers in 1943 alone. 9 fleet carriers in a single year, more than Japan had built in the previous decade. Additionally, 9 Independence-class light carriers would enter service, and approximately 30 escort carriers would be commissioned. 48 carriers in 1 year. Japan's entire carrier building program, operating at maximum capacity, might complete 4 or 5 carriers in 1943. The Americans would commission 48. Koga reviewed the assessment in his cabin aboard the battleship Musashi. He had served as Chief of Staff under Yamamoto, had helped plan the Midway operation, had witnessed the destruction of the Kido Butai. He understood naval aviation, understood carrier warfare, understood the mathematics of attrition, and the mathematics were brutal. For every carrier Japan could build, America would build 10. For every carrier Japan sank, America would replace it with 5. The war had become a race Japan could not possibly win, fought against an opponent whose industrial capacity seemed almost infinite. Koga had been a career naval officer, a specialist in aircraft carrier operations. He had studied the great naval theorists, understood the principles of concentration of force and decisive battle, but all of his training, all of his expertise became irrelevant when facing production numbers like these. There was no tactical brilliance that could overcome a 10-to-1 production ratio. There was no strategic maneuver that could compensate for an enemy who could lose 3 carriers and commission 5 more before the year ended. The intelligence assessment included production projections through 1945. If current trends continued, the United States would commission approximately 140 carriers of all types by the end of the war. 140 carriers. Japan had started the war with 10 carriers. Even with wartime construction, Japan might field 25 carriers total by war's end, including all types. And many of those would be small escort carriers or converted merchantmen, not purpose-built fleet carriers. 140 American carriers versus 25 Japanese carriers. A ratio of more than 5 to 1. But the ratio told only part of the story. Because American carriers were larger, carried more aircraft, and were supported by an industrial infrastructure that could replace losses indefinitely. When an American carrier was damaged, it steamed to Pearl Harbor or San Francisco or Seattle, where shipyard workers swarmed over it, working around the clock until repairs were complete. Damage that would have kept a Japanese carrier in port for months was repaired in weeks. The carrier Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942. Japanese intelligence estimated she would require 3 months of repairs. She was back in action at Midway 3 weeks later, her repairs completed in 72 hours of continuous work by 1,400 workers at Pearl Harbor. When she was finally sunk at Midway, the Americans already had her replacement under construction. They would commission a new Yorktown in April 1943, less than a year after the original was lost. When an American carrier lost aircraft, replacement planes arrived by transport ship or were flown in from rear area bases. When pilots were killed, new pilots arrived fresh from training programs that were graduating thousands of aviators per year. Japanese carriers had no such support. When a Japanese carrier was damaged, it limped back to Kure or Sasebo, where limited repair facilities and scarce resources meant long delays. When aircraft were lost, replacements might take months to arrive. When pilots were killed, they were irreplaceable. Japan's pilot training program, which had produced superbly skilled aviators before the war, could not match the losses being suffered in combat. The pilot training disparity revealed another dimension of American industrial superiority. Training pilots required not just instructors and aircraft, but fuel, spare parts, airfields, and time. Japan was running short of all these resources. Pre-war pilot training had required over 500 hours of flight time. By 1943, new pilots were being sent into combat with 150 hours or less. They lacked the skills to survive against experienced American pilots, and they died in their first or second missions, never accumulating the experience needed to become effective. The Americans, meanwhile, were expanding their training programs. They built training facilities across the southern United States where good weather allowed year-round flying. They had abundant fuel for training flights. They had instructors who rotated back from combat to share their experience. They could afford to train pilots thoroughly because they had the resources to do so. American pilot training in 1943 averaged over 300 hours, and that number would increase as the war continued. The American carrier fleet was not just larger, it was growing faster than it could be destroyed. Every month, more American carriers entered service. Every month, Japanese carrier strength diminished through combat losses and attrition. Admiral Ugaki Matome, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, kept a detailed diary throughout the war. His entry from November 1943 captured the growing despair within Japanese Naval Command. "We have received updated intelligence on American carrier construction," he wrote. "The numbers are beyond anything we anticipated. They are not building a navy. They are building navies, plural, each one larger than our entire combined fleet. We sink one of their carriers and they commission 3 more. We lose 1 carrier and we cannot replace it for a year, if at all. This is not war, this is mathematics, and the mathematics say we cannot win." Ugaki had fought his entire career to build Japan's naval power. He had believed in the primacy of fighting spirit, in the superiority of Japanese training and tactics. But the carrier production numbers forced him to confront a truth he had spent years avoiding. Modern industrial war was not won by courage or skill. It was won by factories and resources and the organizational capacity to mobilize them. Japan had courage and skill in abundance. What Japan lacked were the factories, the resources, and the continental economy necessary to sustain industrial warfare against America. The psychological impact of these numbers on Japanese naval leadership cannot be overstated. These were men who had dedicated their lives to building Japan's navy into a world-class fighting force. They had studied at the Naval Academy at Etajima, absorbed the teachings of Alfred Thayer Mahan, learned the lessons of Tsushima where Admiral Togo had destroyed the Russian fleet. They believed in naval power, in the decisive battle, in the possibility of victory through superior tactics and fighting spirit, but carrier production numbers of this magnitude rendered tactics irrelevant. You could not outmaneuver an opponent who could afford to lose 3 ships for every one you sank and still maintain numerical superiority. You could not defeat an enemy whose shipyards produced carriers faster than your aircraft could sink them. The realization spread slowly through the Japanese naval command structure. Junior officers still spoke enthusiastically about future victories, about new tactics that would reverse Japan's fortunes, but the admirals who saw the intelligence reports, who understood the production numbers, knew better. They continued to issue orders, to plan operations, to send men into battle, but they did so with the knowledge that they were fighting a war that had already been lost, that perhaps had never been winnable. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 provided the final undeniable proof. Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo commanded Japan's mobile fleet, the last major carrier force Japan could assemble, 9 carriers, 450 aircraft. It represented nearly everything Japan had left in terms of naval aviation. The American Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, fielded 15 carriers, 7 Essex-class fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, nearly 1,000 aircraft. The numerical disparity was obvious before the battle even began, but Ozawa believed Japanese pilot skill and tactics might compensate for the difference in numbers. The battle destroyed that belief within hours. American radar detected Japanese strike aircraft at distances exceeding 100 miles. American fighters, directed by fighter control officers using radar plots, intercepted the Japanese strikes far from the American carriers. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft were shot down before they could even see their targets. The Americans had developed a system called fighter direction that used radar to vector fighters toward incoming enemy aircraft. Japanese pilots, approaching in their standard formations, found themselves intercepted by American fighters who had been guided precisely to the interception point. The American pilots had altitude advantage, position advantage, a numerical advantage. The result was slaughter. In a single afternoon, Ozawa lost 375 aircraft. American losses totaled 30 aircraft. 30. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a phrase that captured the one-sided slaughter. Japanese pilots, many of them fresh from abbreviated training programs, could not match American defenders flying superior aircraft with radar direction and overwhelming numbers. 3 of Ozawa's carriers were sunk by American submarines during the retreat. The mobile fleet had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Japan's carrier aviation, which had begun the war as the finest in the world, had been reduced to scattered remnants, unable to challenge American naval dominance. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. After the Philippine Sea, Japanese Naval Headquarters in Tokyo convened an emergency assessment. The admirals gathered to review the strategic situation, though by this point, the situation hardly required review. It required acceptance. Admiral Toyoda, now serving as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, presented the latest intelligence on American carrier strength. As of July 1944, the United States Navy had 92 carriers in commission. 92. This included 14 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and 69 escort carriers. Japan had 17 carriers operational, and several of those were so short of aircraft and trained pilots that they were effectively floating airfields with no planes to launch. The ratio was more than 5 to 1. But the true disparity was even worse, because the American carriers were supported by an infrastructure Japan could not match. Every American carrier operated as part of a task force that included battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all equipped with radar and anti-aircraft weapons of increasing sophistication. American carriers were protected by layered defenses that made approaching them suicidal. American task force commanders could position radar picket destroyers 30 miles from the carriers, providing early warning of incoming attacks. They could establish combat air patrols at multiple altitudes and distances. They could coordinate anti-aircraft fire from dozens of ships simultaneously. Approaching an American carrier task force in 1944 meant running a gauntlet of radar-directed fighters, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, and concentrated firepower from screening vessels. Japanese strike aircraft that made it through all these defenses were often too depleted to conduct effective attacks. Japanese carriers, by contrast, operated with diminishing support. Fuel shortages limited the number of escorts that could accompany them. Ammunition was scarce, spare parts were unavailable, trained maintenance crews had been killed or transferred to other duties. The carriers that remained operational were shadows of what they had been in 1942. Toyota reviewed the production projections one more time. By the end of 1945, assuming the war continued, the United States would have commissioned approximately 141 carriers total, 141. Japan would have built perhaps 25 carriers of all types during the entire war, including conversions of merchantmen and seaplane tenders. Many of those 25 would already be sunk. The rest would be operating with skeleton air groups and minimal support. 141 versus 25. But even that ratio understated the true disparity, because American carriers were not just more numerous, they were better. The Essex-class fleet carriers displaced 30,000 tons, carried 90 to 100 aircraft, and could sustain operations for months without returning to port. Japanese fleet carriers typically displaced 25,000 tons, carried 60 to 70 aircraft, and required frequent returns to base for maintenance and resupply. The Essex-class carriers incorporated lessons learned from early war operations. They had improved damage control systems with better compartmentalization. They had enhanced anti-aircraft armament. They had larger aviation fuel storage with improved fire suppression. They had more advanced radar systems and better crew accommodations. An Essex-class carrier could take damage that would sink a Japanese carrier and still remain operational. American light carriers of the Independence class were roughly equivalent to Japanese light carriers in size, but they carried better aircraft and had superior damage control systems. American escort carriers, though small, were produced in such numbers that they could be assigned to every invasion fleet, every convoy, every support operation. Japan had nothing comparable in either numbers or capability. The quality gap had widened throughout the war. American carrier aircraft had improved dramatically. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter outperformed the Mitsubishi Zero in speed, climb rate, and diving ability. The Vought F-4U Corsair was even better. American torpedo bombers carried larger weapons and had longer range than Japanese equivalents. American dive bombers were more accurate and better protected. The Hellcat had been designed specifically to counter the Zero, incorporating lessons learned from captured examples and combat reports. It was heavier, more durable, and faster in a dive. American pilots developed tactics that exploited these advantages, avoiding the turning fights where the Zero excelled and instead using hit-and-run attacks that leveraged the Hellcat's superior speed and diving performance. By 1944, the kill ratio had shifted dramatically in America's favor. Meanwhile, Japanese aircraft development had stagnated. The Zero, which had dominated the skies in 1941, was now obsolete. Newer Japanese designs, like the Shiden fighter, showed promise, but they arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the outcome. Production bottlenecks, material shortages, and bombing raids on Japanese factories meant that even when superior designs were developed, they could not be manufactured in meaningful quantities. Japan's aviation industry faced problems American manufacturers never encountered. Aluminum was scarce, forcing the use of inferior substitute materials. Skilled workers were being drafted into the military, replaced by inexperienced laborers. Machine tools wore out and could not be replaced. Precision components became increasingly difficult to manufacture to specification. Even when new aircraft rolled off assembly lines, they were often less capable than their design specifications promised, because quality control had degraded. The pilot quality gap had reversed entirely. In 1941, Japanese naval aviators were among the best in the world, with hundreds of hours of training and combat experience. By 1944, most of those pilots were dead. Their replacements received abbreviated training, sometimes as little as 100 hours of flight time before being sent into combat. They were flying inferior aircraft against superior American pilots who now had years of combat experience. American pilots in 1944 averaged over 300 hours of training before entering combat. They flew aircraft with better performance, supported by radar direction and overwhelming numerical superiority. The result was predictable. Japanese aircraft losses mounted while American losses remained sustainable. The Americans had also developed systematic approaches to improving pilot performance. After-action reports were analyzed to identify successful tactics. These tactics were codified into training programs. Pilots rotated home after combat tours to serve as instructors, passing their experience to new pilots. Gun camera footage was reviewed to improve gunnery. The Americans treated pilot training as an industrial process, constantly refining and improving their methods. Admiral Onishi Takejiro, who had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack, proposed a solution in October 1944. Since Japan could not match American numbers or quality, since conventional tactics had failed, the only option left was to multiply effectiveness through sacrifice. Kamikaze attacks, deliberate suicide missions where pilots would crash their aircraft into American ships. The mathematics were brutal but logical. One aircraft, one pilot, one ship. If every Japanese aircraft could sink or disable an American ship, then numerical inferiority might be overcome through willingness to die. It was the final admission that Japan had lost the conventional war, that the only strategy remaining was desperation. Onishi's proposal met with mixed reactions. Some officers embraced it as a manifestation of Japanese warrior spirit, the ultimate expression of loyalty and sacrifice. Others recognized it for what it was, an admission of complete failure. When your strategy depends on your pilots dying to achieve any effect, you have already lost. But there were no other options. Conventional attacks were failing. American defenses were too strong. American numbers too overwhelming. Kamikaze attacks at least offered the possibility of inflicting disproportionate damage. The kamikaze campaign would sink or damage dozens of American ships over the following months, but it could not change the fundamental equation. America was producing ships faster than kamikaze pilots could sink them. For every American carrier damaged by a suicide attack, 2 more were entering service. For every destroyer sunk, 5 more were being launched. American shipyards were producing carriers, destroyers, cruisers, landing craft, merchant ships, all simultaneously, all at rates that exceeded Japan's total shipbuilding capacity. The Essex-class fleet carriers were being commissioned at a rate of 1 every 53 days on average through 1944. 53 days from commissioning to commissioning. Japan took 2 years to build a comparable carrier, assuming materials and resources were available. The escort carriers were even more remarkable. American shipyards were launching escort carriers at a rate of 1 every 10 days at peak production. Some escort carriers were completed in less than 6 months from keel laying to commissioning. Japan could not repair a damaged carrier in 6 months, let alone build a new one. Kaiser Shipyards in Vancouver, Washington, built the escort carrier, Casablanca, in 86 days, from keel laying to launch. 86 days for a complete carrier capable of operating aircraft in combat. The ship was not as capable as an Essex-class fleet carrier, but it could perform anti-submarine patrol, close air support for amphibious landings, and aircraft transport. And Kaiser was building dozens of them simultaneously using the same mass production techniques he had pioneered with Liberty ships. By early 1945, the strategic situation had become absurd. The United States had so many carriers that they were using them for training purposes, for aircraft transport, for roles that did not require frontline combat capability. Meanwhile, Japan's remaining carriers sat in port, immobilized by fuel shortages, lacking aircraft, lacking pilots, lacking any realistic possibility of affecting the war's outcome. The great carrier Taiho, completed in March 1944 at enormous expense, was sunk in June at the Battle of the Philippine Sea after a single torpedo hit caused catastrophic damage. She had been operational for less than 3 months. The Americans lost no fleet carriers at the Philippine Sea. They could afford to lose carriers. Japan could not afford to lose even one. Taiho had been Japan's most advanced carrier, incorporating improved damage control and armor protection. She represented the best Japan's naval architects could design. But one submarine torpedo hit triggered a series of explosions that sank her within hours. The design improvements that were supposed to make her more survivable proved inadequate. Meanwhile, American carriers were taking multiple torpedo and bomb hits and remaining operational, testament to superior damage control training and design. Admiral Ugaki's diary entries from early 1945 reflected the complete collapse of any hope for victory. "We are no longer fighting a war," he wrote in February. "We are witnessing the systematic dismantling of our nation by an industrial power we never understood. The Americans have 130 carriers now in commission. We have perhaps 8 carriers that can operate, and several of those lack sufficient fuel to leave port. This is not a battle between navies. This is the mathematical result of industrial capacity applied to war." In March 1945, Japanese Naval Intelligence compiled a final comprehensive assessment of carrier strength. The document was classified for the Emperor's eyes only, though by this point secrecy mattered little. The war's outcome had been determined not in battles but in shipyards, not by tactics but by production capacity. The assessment detailed American carrier commissionings by year. 1942, 15 carriers commissioned, including 8 escort carriers. 1943, 48 carriers, including 9 Essex-class fleet carriers. 1944, 52 carriers, including 7 more Essex-class ships. Projected for 1945 through war's end, 26 additional carriers. Total American carrier construction, from Pearl Harbor to August 1945, 141 carriers of all types, Japanese carrier construction during the same period, 25 carriers, including conversions and escort carriers. Of those 25, 18 had already been sunk. 7 remained operational, though several were immobilized by fuel shortages or lack of aircraft. The ratio was nearly 6-to-1 in total construction, but the operational ratio was closer to 20-to-1. The Americans had 130 carriers operational in August 1945. Japan had 7, most of them unable to conduct meaningful operations. The assessment noted one additional fact that captured the full scope of American industrial dominance. The United States was reducing carrier production in 1945, not because they lacked the capacity to build more, but because they had built so many carriers that additional construction was unnecessary. They had more carriers than they needed to fight a two-ocean war against Germany and Japan simultaneously. Some Essex-class carriers under construction were cancelled or suspended because the Navy simply did not need them. Construction that had been scheduled was delayed or halted. This was not because America lacked the steel, the workers, or the shipyard capacity. It was because they had achieved such overwhelming naval superiority that building additional carriers served no purpose. They had won the production war so decisively that they could afford to reduce production while still maintaining crushing superiority. Japan, meanwhile, had stopped carrier construction entirely. The shipyards that had built Akagi and Kaga were now building small escort ships and midget submarines. There was no steel for fleet carriers, no time to build them, no pilots to fly their aircraft, no fuel to operate them, even if they could be completed. Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa, serving as Navy Minister, presented the assessment to Emperor Hirohito in April 1945. The Emperor read through the document in silence, then asked a single question. Was victory ever possible? Yonai's answer was honest. No, Your Majesty. Admiral Yamamoto understood this before the war began. He tried to warn us that America's industrial capacity was beyond anything we could match. We did not listen. We believed fighting spirit could overcome material superiority. We were wrong. The Americans built 141 carriers while we built 25. They could have built 200 if necessary. We could not have built 50 even if the war lasted 10 years. The outcome was determined before the first shot was fired. The Emperor's question cut to the heart of Japan's tragedy. The entire war, all the sacrifice, all the death and destruction had been in pursuit of an impossible goal. The military leadership had committed the nation to a war they could not win, based on assumptions that were fundamentally flawed. And now, with Japan's cities burning, with millions dead, with defeat inevitable, they were finally forced to confront the truth that Yamamoto had tried to tell them in 1941. The final Japanese carrier operation of the war occurred in July 1945. The carrier Katsuragi attempted to transport aircraft to Kure. She was attacked by American carrier aircraft and badly damaged. She never operated again. By that point, American carriers were launching strikes against the Japanese home islands with impunity, dozens of carriers, hundreds of aircraft, facing no meaningful opposition. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the United States Navy had 130 carriers in commission. Japan had 4 carriers still afloat, all of them damaged, all lacking fuel, all without operational aircraft. The carrier war had not simply been won by America. It had been an industrial massacre, a demonstration that modern war between industrialized nations was decided not by courage or tactics, but by production capacity. The Japanese admirals who survived the war were interrogated by American intelligence officers. Many were asked the same question. When did you realize the war was lost? The answers varied, but they pointed to the same moment of understanding. Some said Midway, some said Guadalcanal, some said the Philippine Sea, but all of them eventually came back to the same fundamental truth. The war was lost when they saw the carrier production numbers, when they understood that America was building carriers faster than Japan could sink them, when they realized that the United States had commissioned 141 carriers while Japan built 25. Admiral Toyota, who had commanded the combined fleet in the war's final year, was asked by his American interrogators what he thought when he first saw the intelligence reports on American carrier construction. His answer was brief. "I thought Admiral Yamamoto had been right. We had awakened a sleeping giant. But I had not understood what giant meant until I saw those numbers. 141 carriers. We never had a chance, not from the beginning, not ever. We were fighting arithmetic, and arithmetic always wins." The carrier production numbers told the story of the Pacific War more clearly than any battle narrative could. They explained why Japan's early victories meant nothing, why Midway, though tactically decisive, only accelerated an inevitable outcome, why every Japanese success was temporary and every American setback was recoverable. The Americans could lose carriers at Coral Sea, at Midway, at Santa Cruz, at the Philippine Sea, and still have more carriers operating at war's end than Japan ever possessed. They could afford losses that would have been catastrophic for Japan. They could replace sunk carriers faster than Japan could build new ones. They could sustain operations indefinitely, while Japan's strength gradually withered. In the end, the Pacific War was not won by superior tactics or better warriors. It was won in the shipyards of Newport News, New York, Philadelphia, and San Francisco. It was won by welders and riveters and shipyard workers who had never built a carrier before Pearl Harbor, but who learned fast and worked hard and produced ships at a rate that seemed impossible. It was won by an industrial system so vast, so efficient, so productive that military resistance became meaningless. Japan started the war with 10 carriers and built 15 more. The Americans started with 7 and built 134 more, 141 versus 25. The numbers told the story. The numbers explained everything. The numbers were why Admiral Yamamoto had opposed the war from the beginning, why he had warned about awakening a sleeping giant, why he had believed victory was impossible. He had seen the factories, he had calculated the production capacity, he had understood what his fellow officers refused to believe, that modern war between industrial powers was decided by industrial capacity, and that Japan's industrial capacity could never match America's. The admirals who read the intelligence reports in 1943 and 1944 came to understand what Yamamoto had known in 1941, but by then, understanding changed nothing. The war continued because surrender was unthinkable, because the culture demanded fighting to the death, because admitting the mistake would destroy everything they had built their careers upon. So they fought on, knowing they could not win, watching American carriers fill the Pacific, reading intelligence reports that documented their nation's industrial inferiority in numbers too large to deny. 141 carriers. The number represented not just American production, but American potential. The ability to mobilize resources on a continental scale, to convert peacetime economy to war production, to build weapons in quantities that made defeat impossible. The Japanese High Command had said many things when they learned America was commissioning 141 carriers while Japan built 25. Some had spoken of kamikaze attacks and desperate tactics. Some had spoken of negotiating peace. Some had simply fallen silent, understanding that they were witnessing not a military defeat but a mathematical inevitability. But beneath all the different reactions, all the various responses, there was a single shared realization that had come too late to matter. They had awakened the giant, and the giant had brought its shipyards. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.